Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, everybody, and welcome to the 15th webinar conducted by the CELPAD Research Unit. I am Sister Azura, and I will be the moderator this morning for the talk by Dr. Muhammad Khairul bin Abu Sufi entitled CEFR, Written Production Localization in Malaysian Higher Education, Yes or No? So before Dr. Khairul gets to start with that, let me just share with you an introduction about Dr. Khairul. Dr. Khairul was born in Kuala Lumpur, and he earned his undergraduate degree in English language and literature here at IIUM in the year 2000. After graduation from IIUM, he landed a job as a linguist at a speech technology corporation in Belgium and worked there for 3 years. Later on, he came back to Malaysia and joined the PTD service and earned a diploma in public management in 2004 and a master's degree in the field of strategy and diplomacy in 2008. He then left the service and pursued a career in education, where he joined us at CELPAD in 2009 as a language teacher. And from there, he worked to get another master's degrees in applied linguistics and completed that in 2017 here at IIUM. His supervisor at that time was none other than Associate Professor Dr. Unku Haliza Unku Ibrahim herself. And this was in the area of CEFR. And this basically started his passion for language-related policies. In 2002, during the height of the pandemic, Khairul pursued his doctoral degree in IIUM's Kuliah of Education under the supervision of Associate Professor Dr. Faizah Idrus. And 2 years later, he has obtained his PhD in Educational Language Planning and Policy. His current research interest is in the area of CEFR, language planning and policy, and language localization. To date, he has published 3 articles and 1 book section on CEFR-related topics and was invited by a committee based in Europe to contribute a chapter on language management in a book that is to be published by Routledge later this year, alhamdulillah. So personally, we see him as the bubbly character walking around the CELPAD halls, but let me just tell you a bit of his personal background. Dr. Khairul grew up in various countries around the world, including Japan, Canada, Vietnam, and Belgium. Besides English and Bahasa Melayu, Dr. Khairul also speaks Spanish, Flemish, and Dutch. And he is also an avid traveler who has visited 76 countries to date. And he only travels business class. All right. For CEFR, okay, the Common European Framework of Reference, usually abbreviated as CEFR or CEF, describes what language learners can do at different stages of their learning. The CEFR is language neutral, which means that it can be applied to any foreign language learning situation. It was originally designed as a comprehensive reference tool to promote educational transparency and to allow movement between countries for work or study within the European Union. So since its publication in 2001, the CEFR has been translated into 37 languages, and its use has spread outside Europe from Asia to Latin America as an aid to define levels of learning, teaching, and assessment. Okay, in the aspect of English language learning, however, the question that arises is CEFR the best framework to be used? So although the CEFR asserts that its fundamentals are applicable to every language, the CEFR does not account for Englishes spoken outside the inner circle of concentric circles of the world English and its content. So Malaysia is located in the outer circle and possesses particular grammatical and syntactic characteristics that may not appear to be the norm of the inner circle. So therefore, the illustration scales would be incapable of identifying the distinctive characteristics of Englishes outside this inner circle. And this is what Dr. Khairul is going to discuss today. So without further delay, I present you Dr. Muhammad Khairul bin Abu Sufi.
Right. Thank you very much, Sister Azura. What an introduction. I think that there are a lot of things that you have added, which kind of surprised me. But yes, yeah. I would also like to thank the CELPAD Research Unit for this opportunity for me to share my research findings. For today, I wouldn't go in depth about the research because I think that a lot of people would be interested to know what CFR is or how it stands in the Malaysian, especially in the higher education context, since research on CFR in Malaysia revolves around secondary and primary education. Before that, I would also like to note that even though we're so used to calling CFR as CIFR, but it's actually pronounced as CFR. There's no pronunciation. I mean, there's no CFR pronunciation. We don't call it as CFR, but it's actually called as CFR. Yeah. Okay. So I will share my screen. Just give me a sec. All right. Yeah. So let's start. Yeah. Okay. So the topic of today's presentation is the CFR, written production localization in Malaysia higher education. Yes or no? Right. Now, before I start, just like to introduce myself. Again, my name is CRU Webinar No. I'm from the Center for Languages and Pre-University Academic Development, CELPAD, in IIUM. And I hope that this presentation would give you a bit of an insight of what CFR is about and how it impacts us here in higher education. And for those of you who are interested in CFR, you would actually know that a lot of the literature on CFR, especially in the Malaysian context, is usually is circumnavigated around primary and secondary education, and in higher education we are actually left here on our own. Yeah, I'll probably share with you what I have found in my research. Also, this is my PhD thesis. I will not be presenting the whole thesis. This is just a portion of the thesis, a portion of the findings, and I will go in depth about what I think would be important, would be of interest to the audience here today, right? Okay, now, if we start looking into Malaysia's education and language in education policy, you can see that there are actually four different phases, four different spectrums of the LPP in Malaysia, which started way back in the 50s with the Razak report, and then there was also the Talib report. The educational report actually revolves around the usage of Bahasa Malaysia and English. So if you have a look at these four phases, you can see that Malaysia has had a love-hate relationship with the English language and Bahasa Malaysia, where there was always, I could say, which language would supersede the other in terms of education, where, you know, we started off with Bahasa Malaysia being the English of medium, the medium of instruction, and later on we changed to English, and then we changed back to BM, and this has been going on and on and on and on. All right, so since the 1950s, yeah. But what is interesting in our language policy is that in the 90s, there was a realization that English was as important as Bahasa Malaysia. I'm not saying that English is more important than Bahasa Malaysia, but then English was seeing its importance in Bahasa Malaysia, namely due to globalization. And because of that, there was also a change in the educational policy starting from the early 90s, where English became the medium of instruction in private higher education institutions. And this was also brought into the teaching of engineering, science, and medical courses at higher educational institutions where private, higher education institutions were allowed to, public institutions were allowed to teach these courses in English. And then we had the Amendment of the Education Act to make sure that everyone would enjoy English as a medium of instruction. But in the year 2000, we could see that there was more realization of the importance of the English language, where we had the introduction of MUET, which is the Malaysian University English Test, and it was compulsory for each student to take this examination before they enter university. And then in 2003, there was also the introduction of the PPSMI, which is the teaching of science and mathematics in English. Later on, again, the notion of English language became an important issue here in the educational system in Malaysia, where there was a directive, even though it was not written, was actually a verbal directive for using English to teach science and technology courses in higher education. And this was actually made in a speech, it was made in a speech saying that here at higher educational institutions that we should use English to teach science and technological courses, but was actually not made formal in writing. Yeah, but a few universities actually captured onto the change of the language proficiency policy. And some did not. Yeah, of course, here at IIUM, we were not affected since we have been an English medium university ever since its establishment. All right, later on in 2011, what happened was that PPSI was actually phased out by the government, and in 2015, which is the most recent language in education policy reform, we had the introduction of the English language education reform, which is published in a document called the roadmap. So for language teachers, I'm very sure that you are aware of what the roadmap is. For those of you who are not familiar with the roadmap is the latest document spelling out the educational language policy here in the Malaysian educational system for all levels of education, primary, secondary, and higher education. Okay, yeah. If you have a look at this, English in Malaysia, we have two different spectrums also, yeah. In the educational level, we have the school level and we also have the tertiary level. Now, at the school level, as I have said just now, we had the PPSMI, we also have the DLP, which is the dual language program, which is still going on. They also have the CEFR and you also have the MUET. Although MUET is used for entrance into higher education, but students at the school level are supposed to take MUET after Form 6, yeah, before they are actually accepted into universities. Now, at tertiary level, we have the exit test and we also have CFR. Again, if you have a look at this, there is an overlap of the language policy between the school and the tertiary level, which revolves around the usage of CEFR in the educational system. At the school level, the interesting thing is that the language policies or the educational language policies or the educational policies are regulated by either Kementerian Pendidikan Malaysia, KPM. Examinations are also regulated by Majlis Pemeriksa Malaysia, which is the examination syndicate. But here at tertiary level education, we are on our own. All right. So what happens in schools, for instance, is not applicable to what happens here in higher education, since higher educational institutions in the country are autonomous in nature, which means that each institutions are allowed to formulate and come up with their own policies concerning the curriculum or assessment matters, as long as it goes in tandem with what the university wants. Yeah. So this is where the problem arises with CFR. Now, the roadmap wants us to refer to the CFR for all matters relating to language, assessment, teaching and learning of the English language. Now, at school level, this is all done by KPM. But here at tertiary level, every university is doing it on their own. Yeah, so which means that here at IIUM, although that we are using CFR, we are using it based on our interest of the framework. Yeah. What I'm trying to say is that, so if you have 10 different universities, yeah, here in Malaysia, it's not impossible that you will get 10 different versions of the CFR understanding at the 10 universities. So this was something that kind of triggered me to conduct this research, saying that you know, because CFR is so loose in its nature that people are actually allowed to interpret it as and how they want it. There might be a situation where, of course, although that we are on the same, for instance, line. We are aligned in our understanding of what CFR is, but probably our interpretation of CFR might be different from one another. Okay, so looking into CFR, it was established originally to unite the European nations. Yeah, of course, this CFR was started way back in 1970s, but it was actually made into a publication in the year 2000 with the publication of the CFR manual in 2001. And then what they did was that they actually updated the manual all right, in the year 2018. And then there's a third version of the CFR which has just been published. So you can see that there are differences in the not just the conditions, but then again in the illustrative skills. So from one to another, of course, there were improvements, yeah, from one version to another, right? Now, by uniting European nations, what they wanted to do was that they wanted to ensure that Europe was on the same page with one another, saying that if, for instance, yeah, now we know that CFR is actually based on a set of illustrative skills, or they have a set of levels of proficiency or can do abilities that one can do. So it starts from A1 and it finishes at C2. So if I were to say that, say my Dutch is at B2, for instance, yeah. So when I go to, for instance, if I'm in Belgium, I say that my Dutch is at B2, and then when I go to Holland, for instance, when I go to the Netherlands and I see that my Dutch is B2, they will be able to understand, oh, okay, so this is what you are able to do. All right. Now, apart from that, the development of CFR was also to ensure that there was a streamlined policy, especially in terms of migration into the European nations. Yeah. They wanted to use the CFR to ensure that migrants who wanted to come to Europe, yeah, not to say migrants who wanted to come to Europe, but the migrants who came to Europe and they wanted to look for a job or something, all right, that they would have to be tested, and their testing would be based on the levels of CFR, and it would cut across. So which means that if they have been tested for German, for instance, for the German language, and they have been awarded, say, for instance, an A2, if they go to, for instance, France, and they bring their certificate with them saying that they are an A2 in German, people in France will be able to understand that, okay, so we know that you're able to do this and this and this, right? So it was more of, number one, cultural assimilation of the European nations. And number two was more of a mutual understanding so that everyone would be on the same page. All right. Now, CFR was also developed based on native European languages. Yeah. So now in Europe, yeah, you have languages. For instance, you have English, you have French, you have German, you have Dutch, yeah, Spanish, and all those languages. So what the developers of CFR, which is the Council of Europe, what they did was that they had a look at all the different descriptors, yeah, assessment descriptors of the languages in Europe, and they combined them and looked into what was, for instance, useful to be used. Intuitively, what they did was that they looked into what could be put together to ensure that they had a framework which was comprehensive and universal so that everyone would be able to understand what the levels of proficiency meant. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Third, the CFR, it consists of different skills of different proficiencies. So there are more than 130 skills, the illustrative skills of the CFR. And the skills revolve around different modes of language, different skills of language. So in teaching, we would see that there is listening, there is reading, there is writing, and there's also speaking. Also, the latest version of the CFR comes up with the skills of mediation, how one actually mediates with one another. So everything is actually being covered in the CFR. Talking about the illustrative skills, the skills actually range from pre-A1. So this is new, yeah? In the original CFR, it did not have pre-A1, but in the later versions of CFR, it included pre-A1 and it goes all the way up to C2. Before, C2 was called native proficiency, but with the release of the later versions of CFR, C2 was not called native proficiency anymore. But then again, you had a set of skills, what you were able to do, which does not denote native proficiency. But then again, a lot of people would associate C2 with native proficiency. Now, the interesting thing, yeah, about the CFR is that if you have a look at all the skills are loosely developed. And there is a reason for this. Why is it loosely developed? I will explain this later on. And there are also a bit of literature on why Council of Europe have actually devised the skills so that they would be loose in its nature. Yeah. So for those of you who are familiar with the CFR illustrative skill, you'll be able to see that probably if you have a look at what one is able to do at B2 level, it will only come up with like one or two sentences and two or three things, and find some people might find it confusing also. Yeah. Okay. So this is the problem, right? Now, having said what I have said just now, the first problem is that the CFR's development was based on European languages, standards, reference, and culture, right? And this was also said in research by Fody in 2019 and was intended for European usage, yeah? And this is also cited in a very recent research, yeah? Nguyen and Hamid, they're all language policies, yeah? Doing language planning also. So everyone agrees, yeah, not to say everyone, but then again, a lot of researchers in language planning agree that CFR was actually made for its European context, and it was actually made for the European usage only, right? The original CFR, of course, we're talking about the original one, yeah? Right. The second problem is that the written production illustrative skill, and this is what the research is about today, possesses native norms and therefore does not conform to conventions of other languages outside EU. Now, when we talk about native norms, we're not talking about the norms of the English language, but we're talking about the native norms of the European languages, right? Not necessarily English, but then you can possess native norms of the language of French, Spanish, German, yeah? So these are all the descriptors that we have actually looked into when they devised the CEFR, right? Now, this problem is that it does not acknowledge, yeah, Malaysian students' abilities in writing, yeah, which is normal, okay, which is normal, but it can be a problem later on if you intend to achieve. If you intend to achieve what needs to be achieved, yeah, for the Malaysian context, for instance. Thirdly, if you have a look, yeah, at the written production illustrative skill, you can see that the skill of report and essay writing is actually combined into one descriptor, right? Into one skill, right? So you do not have a different skill for report writing, and you do not have a different skill for essay writing, yeah? Now, I'm not sure about other universities, but here at our university, we do have a different assessment skill. We want to look into report writing, and we have a different assessment skill. We want to look into essay writing. And the conventions of the skill, the contents of the skills are also different. But for CFR, it's actually being bound together. So which means that if we were going to come up with what one is able to do for report writing and essay writing, it will be based on the same scale of written production, yeah, the CFR skill for written production. And finally, O'Sullivan and De Jong in 2010, they said that the CEFR is very loose in its design of its illustrative skill, yeah? So this is what I have said just now, different users interpret the skills differently. So is that good or is that bad? Well, I can't say it's good, I can't say it's bad. It depends on how people want to use the CFR, but from my research, I'll try to show you what the research participants have said about what they think about CFR and its illustrative skills, yeah? So the aim today is to determine the extent to which the published CFR written production illustrative skill is suitable in light of local context. So the local context is the Malaysian higher education context. And secondly is to identify the elements that would be considered fundamental towards localizing the CFR written production illustrative descriptor scale. So first, we'll see what the research participants have to say about the CFR. And secondly, if they are agreeable to the CFR, if they don't agree, what they have said should be included in the CFR to make sure that it actually confirms to what is actually expected from the framework. Right, yeah? Now, basically, this is what the CFR would look like, yeah, as a picture, right? Now you have the overall language proficiency, and then you have the general competences, then you have the language competences, language activities, and language strategies, yeah? Now, if you have a look, yeah, if you have a look at the image over here, right? Now we have a look at the competences, savoir, savoir-faire, être, apprendre. We talk about the cognitive skills, for instance. We talk about knowledge, yeah? So we're talking about the types of knowledge that one should possess. We're also talking about the types of skills, the kinds of skills that one should possess. So it's all about knowledge, skills, attitude towards the language, and the ability to learn. So it's an all-encompassing framework that not just covers the cognitive aspect of the language, but also how you perform and the domains that you perform the language in. Yeah. So of course, because of that, when you look into the communicative language competences, you have the linguistic part, you have the social linguistic part, and you have the pragmatic part. Yeah. When combined together, all right, you'll be able to use CFR to come up with, for instance, a curriculum or assessment of communicative related language competences. Yeah, I would like to put it in that way, okay, because I wouldn't say proficiency, but competences, especially in communicative language. Now, for this research, I'm not interested in looking into all the 4 competences, but I'm just looking into the communicative language activities, especially for production. Yeah. Now, everything here is in purple. This is because I'm paying tribute to Sister Azura, who loves BTS, and BTS is purple. So I've done a lot of purple for you there, Sister Azura. Okay. Yeah. So yes. Yeah. I'm going to be looking into the production part of the language activities, especially with the written production. All right. Now, this is a representation of the CFR model. Again, when I said just now, when we talk about strategies, processes, and knowledge, this is the savoir-faire just now. So what we're saying is that there is an interaction between one's cognition. So we are here, all right? So this is our cognition over here, and we're looking into how this interacts with the domains of use, the tasks, domains of use over here. Now, in CFR, the domains of use consists of 4. Right? It's not just communicative language, for instance, for personal use. The domain is the personal domain. You also have the public domain, you have the occupational domain, and you also have the educational domain. And here at Higher Education, I think that we're interested in the educational and also at the occupational domain in order for us to produce students who are what is expected, who are probably of the expectations of the employers who would be interested in them later on. Yeah. All right. Now, so about CFR localization, yeah, this is from the Council of Europe. Now, in the manual, it explicitly, sorry, not explicitly, but then it clearly spells out, yeah, it says that as a user, you are invited to use the scaling system and associate descriptors critically. So which means that it's not set in stone, all right? A lot of people think that CFR is set in stone. So if you have a look at the illustrative descriptor, you think that this is what I'm supposed to use. This is how I'm supposed to use it. No. All right, even the Council of Europe says that you're invited to use it critically. So what does it mean by critically? It means that you have to suit it. Yeah, you have to suit the descriptors. You have to suit the framework based on what is expected out of your institution, for instance, or of the language scenario in the context that it's being used. Yeah. So again, yeah, since, the COE, the Council of Europe, they're very interested to know what people are doing with CFR. They have also asked for experiences, which means that if you have actually used the CFR, they will want to listen to how we have used it and how it has actually benefited us, yeah, in the way, and what are the ways that we have actually used the CFR. Right. Another research by Berger, yeah. Right, I missed the year. Yeah, it was actually in 2010. Yeah, on CFR localization, he said that CFR was created expressly as a common framework for language learning, teaching, and assessment intended to be multi-purpose, flexible, open, and dynamic in nature and orientation. So again, yeah, this is congruent to what the Council of Europe has said. We are allowed to devise, the CEFR based on what we think. No, not devise the CFR. We are able to devise our curriculum, assessment, teaching, and learning materials on what we think would benefit us, but of course, based on the context of the CFR. It's not wrong. It's just there as a guideline. It's a framework for you to use. It's a guide. Like for instance, if we were driving, it would be the highway for a vehicle to follow, right? So it's not set in stones, which means that if the descriptor says that, well, for B2, you have to do this and this and this, A, B, and C, you are able to write a report comprising of, say, for instance, ABC. We, of course, this is our guideline, but then what we have to do is that we have to make sure that it is actually contextualized into the context of our educational situation at that time, yeah? All right. Now, for the global outlook, we can see that there is an increasing number of European nations. Yeah, even in EU, not everyone is adopting the CFR, but since it is a framework over there, a lot more are actually adopting it as their educational language policy also. But yeah, many nations outside of Europe have embraced CFR in their English language teaching and learning, of course. And for instance, here in Malaysia, we can see that we have started to adopt the CFR ever since 2015, and it's been what 7 to 8 years already. All right. IELTS and TOEFL is CFR aligned. Of course, the interesting thing about CFR in the context of Asia is that Japan, Vietnam, China, and Taiwan have actually adopted CFR. They have actually localized CFR into their own context, especially Japan. So now you have the CFRJ, yeah, which stands for CFR Japan. You also have CFRV, CFR Vietnam. So what they did was that they took the framework and then they devised it, they localized it, and then what they did was that they put in elements which would contextualize their education into the framework, or the framework would actually be contextualized into their education, and they came up with their own version of the CFR, and it's not wrong. And they have been very successful in Japan. They've been very successful in Vietnam. Now in China, they have adopted the CFR in their curriculum, which is the college English curriculum for something I can't remember. But in Taiwan, there was also the CFR adoption, right? Now you can see that there's a lot of these nations over here in Asia, which is embracing CFR. Of course, Malaysia is also one of the nations who have also embraced CFR. Now, in the Malaysian outlook, again, what I've said just now, in schools, it's at full force. Our MOET and SPM is also CFR aligned. Now, the motivation, according to the roadmap, is for international recognition. Why international recognition? So that our certificates would be at par with the certificates of other English language testing systems. Also, we want to avoid the disparity of a locally produced framework. Yeah. Okay. So you might ask, yeah. Now, Cairo, you said that, well, we should probably localize it. But then again, the roadmap said that we do not want to produce something which is locally. So how does that work? Yeah, that's a very good question. Now, come up with the answer after this, towards the end of this presentation, right? Now, CEFR at primary educational institutions, teachers are still grappling, and they are resistant, right, to accept CEFR in primary education. In secondary education, they are also grappling, but the acceptance is higher in comparison to secondary in primary education. But there are also actions of its implementation. Here in higher education, I would still say that it's still in its infancy stage, and our research on CFR higher education mainly revolves around assessment, also about perception of CFR, not much about what has been researched in primary and secondary educational system, yeah, in the Malaysian context, right? Okay, now this study, again, yeah, what I wanted to do was I wanted to find out whether there was actually a need to localize the CFR descriptor, the CFR illustrative descriptor scale, especially in the written production form, yeah? So what I have used is that I have used, the participants of this study were students and also academics, but students did not participate. What they did was that they provided the materials that would be used in the research. Yeah, so I collected the writing scripts from many universities, yeah, around the country, yeah, from Peninsular Malaysia and also from Sabah Sarawak. There were 241 scripts. Unfortunately, only 150 could be used. Why? Because a lot of it was plagiarized. Mind you, this research was actually done during the height of the pandemic, yeah, in 2020, right? So everything was actually done online, right? There was no physical data collection. Everything was done online, all right? So in order for me to collect the writing scripts, the students would have to be in public higher educational institutions, all right? They would have taken MOET from band 1 to band 6, all right? And also, they were all Malaysian students, okay? Malaysian students. The academics consisted of 10, right? 10 participants, and also had 2 CFR master trainers who also participate in the research. There were also academic staff teaching English, especially writing. They were also involved in the assessment of writing, and they were also employed at public higher educational institutions, right? Now, I have collected data for this research from 6 different universities, not just here in Peninsular Malaysia, but also from Sabah and Sarawak. At first, I did not want to collect from Sabah and Sarawak, but then again, we wanted to know what our friends on the other side would like to have to say about CFR. And I'm very glad I did that, because we discovered that no matter where you are, no matter which university you are, wherever, north, south, east, west, everyone is saying the same thing about CFR right now. Okay, so I have these universities. Of course, it's all in pseudo, all right, but I think you can kind of guess where each university is, all right. Okay, the instruments that we used to collect the data, of course, we had the writing scripts from the students, and then we had the rater pro forma. This was only done for the academics. And then I conducted semi-structured interviews with all the participants, and then I also distributed an open-ended questionnaire to understand what they thought of the localized version of the CFR, for instance, Okay, now the findings, All right, wow. Okay, so the first finding, the first question, to what extent is the published CFR written production illustrative scale suitable for local context use? Now, generally, most of the participants, almost all of the participants, they all agree that CFR is a framework for measuring language proficiency. Right? Now, this is also interesting, because CFR is actually developed for teaching, learning, and language assessment. But when you look into what the participants had to say about CFR, they said that it's a framework for measuring language proficiency only, okay, which means that it's always related to the assessment part, right? Secondly, the participants also associated CFR with European context. Okay, this is probably very clear. Of course, you have the word European in the word CFR, right? So that is why it's being linked to the European context. Another interesting revelation about CFR in Malaysian context is that the participants all agree that CEFR is linked to the English language. So when you talk about CFR, it's about English. When you go to anyone, you talk about CFR, you go like, oh, CFR is the English language framework, right? Yes, that's what we think about in Malaysia. It's the English language framework. But CEFR is supposed to be a framework that encompasses all languages, which means that if we're going to be adopting CFR here in Malaysia, CEFR can be used for English, it can be used for, here in IIUM, it can be used for Arabic, for instance, it can be used for Bahasa Malaysia, for instance, So it can be used for any languages, It's fine. Next, they all agree that CEFR is a mutual currency of language intelligibility. So, when you talk about currency, you say that CFR is something which is valuable, something which carries with it worth, which carries with it a bit of value. It's not just something which should just brush aside. There is actually value to the CFR. And again, so I said just now, finally, that everyone agrees that CFR is used for assessment purposes. Very interesting. Now, positively, the participants also recognize CEFR as an English language education policy, and they all agree that it is appropriate in the Malaysian higher education context. So there's no issue. Why should we have to localize the CFR if it is appropriate in the Malaysian higher education context? What is the problem? This is the problem, right? Now, there is lesser emphasis in higher educational institution context, because I said just now, because here at HEI, since we are autonomous in nature, we are somewhat liberal from what the ministry wants us to do to the letter, very specific, Okay, so they'll say that, okay, all universities are supposed to follow CFR, all right, and then they want to know at the end of the day that CFR is being adopted in the teaching and learning, for instance, right? So secondly, the participants say that the CFR is not properly introduced in the higher educational context. Of course, I think that a lot of the participants at higher educational system, they all said that their exposure of CFR was limited to that workshop that was conducted, the cascading workshop that was conducted, and that was it. And nothing else happened after that. So they had a cascade workshop of CFR, and then what? What happened? Nothing ever happened after that, And then they also said that CFR is left to their self-interpretation. They said that it's ambiguous, And finally, it does not represent Malaysian higher education standards. So again, yeah, so what is the problem? This is the problem. All right, with CFR in the Malaysian higher education context, we are interpreting the CFR based on how we understand it, which is not wrong. All right, it's ambiguous. All right, so what's wrong with being ambiguous? Also, it does not represent Malaysian higher education standards. So what, people might ask? Well, there is a big problem. Now, if you say that it's left to self-interpretation, again, when I said just now, yeah, the roadmap spells out that higher educational institutions in the, public higher educational institutions in the country is to align, not to align, but then is to ensure that their teaching, learning, and assessment is informed by CFR. Okay, now say for instance, you're here at IIUM, right? Now we have a look at a scale, for instance, yeah? We have students here who are probably at A1, yeah? At A1, yeah, for those of you who have taught level 1 English, you would know that it's very taxing in class where you have to go in front of the class and you have to act and say, like, for instance, fall, walk, okay? All right, now at other universities, they do not accept A1, for instance, okay? They do not accept A1. For instance, they say, well, you're at higher education, then they should not be A1. Of course, this is what these are just examples of self-interpretation. Or for instance, yeah, I also discovered that there is an education, a higher learning education institution, which have come up with their own version of the CFR descriptor for writing. Yeah, so they came up with this descriptor from A1 up to C2, and I did sense some universities do not agree that there is actually A1 to C2. So we're not on the same page. So is that a problem? Yes, it's a problem if we're going to be using CFR as a currency for our language ability in the future. Yeah. So of course, it's left to self-interpretation. There is also ambiguity, and it does not represent the Malaysian higher education standards. Yeah. So to answer the question, to what extent is the CFR suitable for local context? Well, our research participant says that it is suitable, but to a limited extent. And this actually concurs with research from Japan and Vietnam. Yeah, so from Japan in 2016, 2013, and 2016 from three different authors who say that even CFR in their context in Japan is also suitable, but of course to a certain context. And Vietnam also said the same thing. Yeah, research about CFR in Vietnam, they also have said that CFR is also suitable in the Vietnamese context, however, to a limited extent. So a lot of research have also concluded and suggested that appropriate localization of the CEFR, of course, in this context is the written production illustrative descriptor, could be applied to suit local perspectives. And this is also in line with previous research, yeah, by, for instance, Harsh, Professor Harsh, from Martin, Harsh, and CEFR. These are also very recent research, and this research were all conducted in Europe. So what they did was that they actually localized the CEFR based on the local European context. And now if you read this research by Harsh over here, you can see how she localized the CEFR writing descriptor based on the conventions of a local German school. Yeah? So it's a fantastic researcher saying that it is possible to actually localize the CFR and it yields better results. Yeah. Okay. Now, because we were interested to understand, yeah, how it could be localized. This is the, I would say, the crux of the findings, yeah, of my research. Yeah. Now, I wanted to know what are the fundamental elements that should be considered when localizing the CFR written production illustrative scale. So, this is the spectrum of what I have actually discovered. Yeah. Now, if you can see over here, it's actually put into. I've actually differentiated into like so many different boxes. Number one is the theoretical underpinning. Yeah, so this is the theory that I have actually used in this research to come up with the localized version of the CFR, which was from Bachman and Palm in 1996. This is the language model. We have the grammar, textual, functional, social linguistic. Also additional elements. This was suggested by the research participants. The one in purple are the findings. Okay, all right. This is the findings from the research participants. So research participants say that for grammar, there should be, for instance, syntax. There should be tenses. There should be mechanics should not be there. Yeah, that's my bad. Yeah, mechanics should be under probably style. Okay, but this is what they have said. Yeah, for instance, textual for textual. Yeah, textual understanding of the text. You have cohesive devices, signals, linkers. For functional language, social language, there should be content and organization. There should also be vocabulary differences. So this is what I have actually found. I was overwhelmed with data. Yeah, I was like, oh my God, there's so many things that needs to be included. So how am I going to put all this into something which is so simple? All right. Now, if you have a look next, now this is what the original skill looks like. Okay, so this is from the latest version of the CFR at C1 for written production. There are only 3 sentences there. For instance, they can say, can produce clear, well-structured expositions of complex subjects, underlining the relevant salient issues, and so on. So from here, what I did was that I understood the context, yeah, the gist of the CFR, and what I did was that I had to also understand the gist of what the research participants want. And this is the end product of my localization. Okay, so instead of something that comes up with probably 3 lines, I came up with a proper descriptor, all right, which had, for instance, which addresses the completion of a text, yeah, the content organization, the coherence, grammatical issues, mechanics, and also the sociolinguistic part, yeah. It's a lot, yeah. It can be overwhelming, but of course, it's just a first draft, and I just use this for my PhD research. Of course, it can be refined, but to show that the localization actually worked, right? I conducted, to show that the localization actually worked, I actually conducted a very simple statistical analysis, and I'll share the results with you later on. Okay, all right, yeah. Now, so what are the fundamental elements that should be considered when localizing the CFR written production illustrative scale? Number 1, it should be based on Malaysian higher education context. Yeah, this is also supported by researchers such as Danya et al. In 2019. This is a nice one. I agree to this one very, very much. Yeah, we should include regional Englishes. So which means that if we're going to localize CFR, of course, Japan and Vietnam have also localized it, but if we were to localize CFR here in Malaysia, why not we localize it based on the regional understanding, right? A question that was actually posed to me, well, Khairul, do you think that the English here in Malaysia is actually similar to the English of our neighboring nations? My question, no, of course not. But what we can use is that we can use the model of World English, yeah, the one that Sister Azra has said just now, right? So CRU what he did was that he actually divided nations into the concentric circle, the concentric circles of World English. We have the inner circle, we have the outer circle, and we have the expanding circle. Now, Malaysia sits in the outer circle, okay? Now, the other nations that sit in the outer circle with Malaysia is Singapore, Brunei, all right? And the Philippines, for instance. So maybe we can have a look at that, yeah? So which means that we will have a regional localization of CFR instead of one which just confines to the Malaysian context. So again, the roadmap wants something which is not supposed to be only produced locally and is only important in the local context. Maybe we can expand it to become regional rather than local. Next, it should have a linguistic profile. So I have actually outlined what the linguistic profile was based on the research participants. And of course, the research participants also suggested that there should be authentic responses, which means that if we were going to localize the CFR, we should use the students' writing, you know, what they have actually produced in the classroom or what they can produce. And we come up with our version of the descriptor based on the CFR, based on the students' writing, which makes it a bit more authentic and original. Right, yeah? So again, yeah, this is my statistical analysis. Yeah, before I localized the CFR, and then I conducted the ICC, the correlation, yeah, between the pre and post localization. I achieved an ICC of 0.768 before it was localized. So what I did was that I gave them the original CFR descriptor. All right, I gave them a set of writing papers they had to mark, and then the rate of agreement between one rater to another was not bad, was at 0.768. But once I localized it, I gave them the descriptor, and then they marked a different set of papers. It yielded better results. It was almost perfect, yeah, at 0.961. And I myself was also quite surprised because I didn't expect to get a correlation which is quite high. It's almost absolute, yeah. All right. But then again, I was convinced that the localized version of the CFR descriptor that I came up with as a result of this research was useful to the research participants, and they found it also to be beneficial. Yeah. So, all right, the implications of this research. Yeah, this is probably my last slide. There is an urgent need, number one, to steer those at the micro planning level. Right now, we here at the university, we are at the micro planning level. Okay. Now, if you look into the model of language planning, right? All right. In Malaysia, it's always a top-down. Yeah? It's always top-down, which means that what comes from the government is only being cascaded to us, so we have to follow, right? But recent research, yeah, so this is the one which was published in 2011 by Chua and Baldoff, right? They say that language planning can happen at any stage, all right? Any stage of the language planning model. So usually we would start from the supra-macro and it goes all the way down to the infra-micro. Okay, so this is what's happening in Malaysia. Over here, number one, we have the government. So what the government does is that comes up with the policy. The policy is brought down to the in schools to the regional levels by the PPD and whatnot. And it's being transferred into the schools. All right. The same thing with higher education. Everything happens here at the supra macro planning level. Right, and everything is being said. So, okay, universities, this is what you have to do, right? But research, yeah, ever since 2011 said that language planning can start at any stage, yeah. And the research by Chua, yeah, a Singaporean, yeah, she's a professor in the US right now. She said that micro planning right now plays a very important role. Why? Because micro planning actually provides the success to the supra macro planning level. So what we're doing over here, right, at this level, the institutional level, we can have an impact of what's happening up there at the supra macro level. Okay, and this has happened in Singapore, in Australia, in New Zealand about their native languages. Of course, in Singapore, it's about the language of Chinese, yeah. But of course, in Australia and in New Zealand, it was more about the native language, right? And it worked, right? So language planning at the macro level was successful because there was a lot of participation from the micro planning level, okay, which is our level, okay. So the success of a macro planning level is important, is dependent on the success of the language planning at the micro level, okay. So yeah, if you're interested in language planning, that's what it's about, yeah. Okay. Next, we have to relook into the tenets of the CFR written production illustrative descriptor. Of course, what I said just now, probably what we can do is that we can expand it. There's a need to also ensure that there's one mutual understanding and agreement. So, of course, when I conducted this research, I started in 2020, but now I understand that there is also a committee, yeah, among all the public universities. What they're doing right now is they're sitting down, trying to look into the CFR right now. So I'm not sure what's happening over there, but even the research participants have also suggested that there should be a one mutual understanding agreement, right, between the universities, right? In trying to come up with a more refined version of CFR, what we should do is that we should gauge on students' actual English language proficiency. And finally, which I find most interesting, is that there's probably a need for us to work together with neighboring nations, especially with those who share the same language portfolio as Malaysia. So my bet would be like, if we wanted to come up with our version of CFR, probably we could work together with Singapore, and we can work together with Brunei and Philippines, for instance, and come up with CFR, for instance, CFR Asia or something like that, which is a bit more beneficial than coming up with CFRM, which is mutually exclusive for the Malaysian context only. All right, thank you very much. Sister Azura, back to you.
Thank you so much, Brother Khairul, for the comprehensive talk just now. Now, this CEFR research is directly related to us as CELPAD staff, isn't it? Because we do a lot of assessments here, okay, and our EPT right now is linked to CEFR. So it is hoped that this talk will somehow help to maybe improve on the system if it has not been improved on yet. Of course, there are new things coming up all the time. So now we're taking questions from the audience. If you want to ask a question, you can actually raise your hand, all right, and we'll call on you. Something that intrigues me about Dr. Khairul is that his motivation, basically, of how he did his PhD in such a short while. A lot of people did embark on their PhDs at the same time as he did, but some of us have not even sent in our proposals yet. So how is it, Dr. Khairul, that you had that type of motivation to be able to complete your PhD in about 18 months?
To me, it's all about self-discipline. I treated my PhD as my job. So what I did was that I came to, again, when I say this was actually done during the pandemic, right, in 2020, when people were not at the office or people were all at home, but I got permission to come to the office from our director, Dr. Rosnani. So I came to the office every day from 8 o'clock in the morning, and I left at 9 o'clock. Every single day, just working on this. There was not a day that I did not work on my PhD research. So to me, it's all about self-discipline. But at the same time, when you talk about self-discipline, you do not forget your me time also. So when I went back home, right, I enjoyed Netflix also. I went out with my friends, I met up with you, for instance, right? So there was a work-life balance, but I treated my PhD as my job. It was something that I wanted to achieve. So it was something that I could just not put aside. So it was all about knowing that this is something that you have to complete. This is an assignment that you have to complete it within the stipulated time. And of course, the most important thing is like what my supervisor said, is that you have a timeline. So once you have a timeline, you have a set target that you have to know that, for instance, you're going to work in chapter 1. It's supposed to be due in 3 months. You have to make sure within that 3 months that you have actually completed your chapter 1 for submission to your supervisor for further elaboration. And that is what I did. And I stuck to the timeline, to the to the schedule of going to the office and coming back home at night, stuff like that. So I just did that. It was all about self-discipline. It was nothing more than that. Everyone can do it. It's just a matter of how you work around your PhD. That's what I would say would actually make me finish my PhD in 18 months.
All right, thank you, Dr. Khairul. I keep on calling you Brother Khairul. I'm so sorry. I have to get accustomed to calling you Dr. Khairul. Okay, any questions from the audience? Another thing I would like to comment on is because IIUM, being an Islamic university, and when we look at our textbooks sometimes, English textbooks, there are things there which can seem a bit odd for students who come from the Middle East, who come from more, how would I say it, traditional Islamic countries, to read about. For example, there was one question before in for our exam about unwed mothers, and this is so not their culture. All right, so and so we had to explain to them that people don't have to be married to have babies. Okay, they were very confused about that. So is this somehow related to the CEFR as well, where culture plays a role in assessments and asking questions and all that? Because they did not understand the question because it did not exist in their culture.
All right. Okay. This is very interesting about the textbooks. The suitability of the textbooks and whatnot. Now, if we look at the CFR textbook, it's very much related to culture of the West. But of course, now you have textbooks which are looking to different cultures of around the world. But again, we're going to look into things about what is actually not the norm of a specific culture, like we said just now about the unwed mothers, or for instance, going to a bath and all that. You have all that in the CFR textbook. To me, I think personally, that it does not go back to CFR, but it goes back to IOK, which is Islamization of knowledge, where as lectures, as Murabi, what we're supposed to do is that we're supposed to take it and compare it to Islam, for instance, yeah, and this is Dr. Khairia's forte, yeah, where, you know, when we have a look, say, for instance, right, we do not say reject it, but we say, well, this is what's done in that culture, but what is done in our culture, how can you differentiate that? So probably, you know, by doing that, you can get that plurilinguistic exposure of what other cultures are in comparison to our culture. So probably if you wanted to tackle CFR, the cultural part, I would say that you have to bring in your own experiences of IOK or IOK, because I know my sister who's teaching at secondary schools right now, yeah, she's saying that students at secondary schools, they just don't understand. And when you talk about picnic, why does a picnic have to have a picnic mat? Why does it have to have a picnic basket? Why are there sandwiches, you know?
Is this more relevance for rural students?
Not really, because she's in Kemaman, and students in Kemaman were also asking, what's the relevance of having all this? And then she said, well, this is what happens in the West. When you go on a picnic, you bring your picnic basket, you bring your picnic mat. And then she would actually bring in what is actually done in our culture. For instance, when we go for picnics, right, we go to, for instance, to the waterfall, okay, we go to the river, okay, riverside or whatnot, right? So it's the same thing, yeah. Since here at IIUM, we do come across things which we do not find pleasing, especially in textbooks. I'm not sure about the textbooks that we're using right now, but you know, in a lot of textbooks where you have, for instance, going to the bar, ordering a drink, right? We could use that, but again, what we can do is that we try to imbue Islamic perspectives into, well, if that's how it's done over there, how are we supposed to do it over here? How are we supposed to do it over here? And to me, that is the success of CFR and IOK both at the same time.
All right, I've got a question here from Brother Daniel from YouTube. Dr. Hyrule, in IIUM context, we have a number of international students. If we localize CEFR in Malaysia, will it affect them or the learning process?
Okay, now yes, we do have, sorry, the question was international students?
Yeah, we have a number of international students. So if we localize CEFR to Malaysian context, will it affect them or the learning process? Because they are not Malaysians.
Of course, all right, yeah. Now, for my research, what I did was that I only used Malaysian participants, right? So that's why just now, when I was talking about the localization, I think it's better to have a regional localization. So when we have a regional localization, it does not only confirm to the Malaysian scenario, it confirms to a more regional scenario. So to answer Brother Daniel's question, if we were to localize it based on the proficiency of our Malaysian students, then it might not be relevant for the international students. But if we were to localize it based on proficiency of the students studying in Malaysia, and then that would solve the problem. All right. So for my research was only for Malaysian students studying at public higher education institutions. But if we were to localize CEFR into the Malaysian context, it's best that we include both international and local students, and also at public and private universities, probably. Right. So yes, yeah, not if we were only to use Malaysian students, it would not solve the problem of the international students. So it would have to be a mixture of both. So which means the data collection would have to change, the method of the localization would have to change. But then again, it all goes back to localization. Yeah, when we localize based on a regional or on a national level, it would help provided that the data is consistent with what we are trying to do.
All right, thank you for the question, Brother Daniel. Anyone else? Any questions from the audience, either here in Zoom or in YouTube?
Perhaps I can ask something.
Yes,
yeah, so Dr. Hyrule, can we go back to a couple of your slides? I think the one that had the macro.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, that
one.
one.
Share that with you?
Could you just share that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just give me a sec. Okay, so about language policy, yeah?
Yeah, this super macro level, macro planning, micro planning.
Yeah.
And then we've got the infra micro planning. So
Mhm.
you're saying that CEFR can be interpreted or can
CFR,
be,
you know me?
sorry?
CEFR, yeah.
CEFR, correct. Thank you. All
Tongue
right.
twister.
Because it's easier to pronounce when you make it a word instead of four, separate alphabets as an acronym. You were saying that this can be implemented as, on from the higher up top to
Yeah.
bottom. And actually everyone can play their role in implementing it at their own levels.
That's right.
Right. Okay. But that's I would say that would be the theory or the ideal situation, right? Because when as as implementers, we're down here and we see things. When we change things, it doesn't move much. There's not much power in our hands to actually get the ball rolling, because it's in that particular context that we can do things, but it doesn't go anywhere else. And later down the road, the ministry might say, no, you've got to change the whole thing. And what we've done is actually, no, we've got to go back to square one. So I'm not sure whether that's actually a question, but that's actually my take on it, right? That we can't actually change anything.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Narmi. Now, of course, yeah, in Malaysia, we follow the classical language planning policy. Yeah, classical language planning is from the macro, micro, macro, meso to the micro, which means that we don't have a say. We just follow everything that's being done. Yeah. So this is what you're saying right now. It's so the ministry says, okay, you have to do CFR, and we're just doing CFR. Yeah. But of course, yeah, that's what you just now. This is the ideal model of language planning, where it can happen at any stage of language planning. It can be at the infra micro, it can be at the micro planning, but research, yeah, past research, and we're not just talking about just one or two research, but we're talking about international level research. You have done micro planning, which have actually made way for the macro planners up there to actually change the ways that things are being done. Yeah, but of course here in Malaysia we can't change that because it's a draconian system, as I would say. Am I allowed to say that?
Yeah,
because what happens here at the institutional level, we're at the micro planning level, right? So we can't change everything what's happening up there. But yeah, when you look into language planning, all right, it doesn't just go from top to bottom, it can go from bottom to top, for instance. And a lot of nations who have actually done this has been successful in the language planning. For instance, when I say just now about Singapore, right? So Professor Chua from Singapore, she has actually written about how schools in Singapore have actually taken what was from the macro level, which means the policy at the macro level. And what they did was that they actually changed it and it became a policy at the macro level. Why? Because the people at the micro planning level were also doing it. Yeah, they were also doing it. And they said, well, it's worth that we change it. So it's very important, yeah, for those here at the micro planning level to do what, not to say what we feel is right, but what I'm trying to say is that it's very important for a language policy to be successful in any nation, that the role of the micro planners here, us over here, is very important, because we are the one who ensures the success of those at the macro planning level, at the supra macro especially. Yeah, good observation.
For the IPT level, Dr. Harold, do we not have our own policies on this?
We do. We are autonomous in our nature. So if we have look here, we are here at the micro planning level. But the problem right now is that we're still bounded by those happening here, which means that, okay, for instance, CFR, okay? CFR came from the supra macro planning. So government says, okay, everyone has to follow CFR. So what's happening right now? Kita kat bawah ni at the micro planning, okay, we'll just follow what's happening. But, right, if we play a role at the micro planning level, we see that, well, this is not something that should happen. It should not happen like this. This is how it should happen. And then if everyone, especially that the universities are autonomous, you know, that if everyone is doing, not to say their own thing, but then if everyone comes up with their own, for instance, way of implementing the policy that has been cascaded from the top, and at the top, you know, sees that, well, okay, this is working from what's happening there at the bottom, that it can be included as a policy that is to be implemented, for instance. Yeah, but sadly, do not find that in our context. Yeah, the nearest I would find how this works out ideally is sadly in Singapore, right? But not in Malaysia, not yet, probably not yet. Maybe in Army you can make a change.
Yeah, but that's probably because, you know, the political, there's not much interference. You get the experts, those who are actually in the field, academicians, to actually guide educational policies. Not like every 5 years we change, you know, how we go about certain things.
Yeah.
Right? The
Yes.
local.
Yes. And you know, Narmi, since you have said that, yeah, since you have actually opened the floodgates, yeah, that was actually a finding from my research. Yeah, they were saying that, well, Cairo, you know, this is just not, it's not going to stay. When we have a new minister, we're going to have a new language policy. When we have a new government, we're going to have a new language policy. And I say I can't say much about that. But then again, based, you know, on what I have said just now, if you have a look at what happened here, all right, it's self-explained, right? Kan. Now you see, this is 2015. We don't know how long this is going to last, but Alhamdulillah, yeah, it's been 7 years already. And when I embarked on the CFR research, people were telling me, "Are you sure you want to do CFR? Are you sure that it's going to sustain?" Well, for the time being, it's here to stay. It's here to stay, but yeah, we're not sure for how long. But hopefully it stays, because I've got so much work already. But if we follow language planning policy, yeah, people here at the micro planning level or the infra micro planning level would actually make changes to those at the supra macro planning level. Hopefully we can see that change later on. But Narmi, what's happening right now, what I see concerning CFR in higher education, and of course we do have the policy of the roadmap saying that, okay, all public higher educational institutions are supposed to ensure that their policy is, their teaching, learning, and assessment is informed by CFR. There is a CFR committee here at the micro planning level where all the local institutions have come up with this this, what do you call that? Yeah, it's like a team. Yeah, so what they're doing is that they're discussing CFR at higher educational level. Can't remember, it's the CFR team. I can't remember what it's called, but that is what's happening right now. So here we at the micro planning level are doing something to ensure that the planning at the macro level is going to work. So hopefully by the time they stop convening and actually come up with something concrete, that we'll see the implementation of CFR a bit more systematic and organized at higher educational institutions. And then you would see how this model of language planning actually works in Malaysia.
So let's hope that will happen soon. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
There's a question from Sister Shazwani. What is your view about having all HIEs in Malaysia streamlining their courses?
Streamlining courses is tricky. It's very tricky. Yeah, it can be streamlined on a set of guidelines. That's not a problem. But streamlining the courses, say for instance, yeah, we have English for academic writing in IIUM, which is the same with UTM, which is the same with UPM or USM. That would be very tricky because each university has their own visions and missions. For instance, in IIUM, we have about the internationalization, which other universities might not have. So I wouldn't say that we should streamline our courses, but we should streamline the aims. Yeah, we should streamline the aims and the end product of the courses. That would be a better bet rather than streamlining the courses, I should say. All right, thank you, Sister Shazwani.
All right, thank you for the question, Sister Shazwani. Do we have any other questions? Maybe we can take one or two more questions before we leave. Okay, so from that was the last question from YouTube. From Zoom, does anyone here have any questions to ask Dr. Jairo? Okay, so if that was the last question from Sister Shazwani, I would really like to thank Dr. Harold Sufi for his time today, okay, in telling us about sharing with us his findings about his CEFR research. He says it very fast. I cannot say it as fast as he can. CEFR research. And it is really hope that, you know, we take this in with eyes wide open. All right, we cannot just take one policy and accept it as a whole without being critical about it. And this is something, this is the task of, I think, all of us who work in universities, whereby, you know, we have to question certain things and try out certain things in order for the betterment of our students and our environment, and not just stick to one policy that you feel that will benefit everyone, which it may not. Okay, so this is a real eye-opener for most of us, inshallah, hopefully.
So Sister Azura, I just want to say, in
Yeah.
conclusion, CFR is not bad, it's good.
Yeah.
I'm critical about CFR, but I do not reject CFR. I'm just saying that, you know, what we can do is that we can make CFR better, all right, if we actually contextualize it to the situation that we're using, right? So, you know, I'm not trying to say that I am against what is happening right now. It's just that it can be better if we look into what is actually needed at our level and what we want and how we want to come up with it, that everyone is on the same page rather than everyone having their own ideas of what they think would want to happen. Yeah.
Okay, so with that, thank you so much, Brother Hairul. And thank you all for coming this morning, for making time to be with us. And this marks the end of the 15th session of the CRU webinar. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Inshallah.